We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara and Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 13b. On the previous summit, we had a contradiction in terms of the machshavas pigel, which is an intention to consume a carbon outside of the proper time frame. There's a contradiction whether that applies during the kabbalas hadam, whether that applies during the receiving of the blood or not. And the Gemara now continues and answers, Ela lo kasha, rather it's not difficult. Hadi Omar, in one case we're talking where the person says, Hareini shochet al menas lekabel dama lemachar, I'm slaughtering the animal with the intention to receive the blood tomorrow. In that case, that is not considered a case of pigel, and it is not disqualified. But Hadi Omar, but in the other case where it is considered pigel, that's where the person says, Hareini mekabel dama, I'm receiving the blood, so this is taking place during the receiving of the blood is when he's having the intention, and the intention is almanas lishboch shirayim l'machar, with the intention to pour out the remainder of the blood tomorrow, that is considered to be pigel. And Rashi explains, and Rashi can be found on the previous Amud, lo kash, it's not difficult. Hada katani le'el, machsheves kabbalah lo pasla bepigel. When we said earlier that the intention by the kabbalas hadam does not disqualify by pigel, lo keshechishe b'shas kabbalah al achilas basar. That's not talking about when the person has intention during the time of the kabbalas hadam regarding the consumption of the meat. That actually would be pigel. Ela b'mechashe b'shas shchita al menas lekabel dam lemachar. We're talking about a situation where a person has an intention during the time of the slaughtering that he's going to receive the blood tomorrow. That kind of machshava is not considered a machshavas pigel. The ilu zrika kahagavna. Now, if it would be, let's say, throwing the blood in such a scenario, asaba machshava kamaisa, there we would consider the intention like an action. Meaning, imshachat almanas lizrok dam lamachar. Let's say a person would slaughter with the understanding that he's going to throw the blood tomorrow. That is pigel. That's considered pigel. Dehainu achilas mizbeach. That's considered to be achilas mizbeach. The basic idea is that it's considered pigel if a person during an avoda has an intention of some kind of achila of the carbon, that's going to be done at the wrong time. It could be the achila of the person, it could be the achilas mizbeach. This Rabbi behedya afilu shvichas shirayim lekamon. Even the pouring out of the remainder of the blood is considered to be an achila in this regard. And hadamar v'haida katani minayin l'rabba shchita v'kabbalah, when it says that we are including kabbalah in terms of pigel, that's mechashe b'shas kabbalah. That's when the thought, the wrong intention is during the receiving of the blood. Almanas lishboch shirayim, again with the intention to pour the remainder of the blood at the wrong time. O achas misharhu achilos kamri, or one of the other achilos, one of the other consumptions of the carbon. And the Gemara continues, Amar le'ahume rabbanon l'Rava, one of the rabbanon said to Rava, ushvichas shirayim v'aktaras emurin, the pouring out of the remainder of the blood and the burning of the sacrificial portions on the mizbeach, lo pasla b'hu machshava, there's no disqualification of a machshavas pigel over there. V'hatanya, but we learned in a brisa, yachol lote machshava moelas ela b'achilas basar, one might think that the machshava of pigel is only going to be problematic, it's going to be effective to disqualify by the consumption of the meat. Minayin l'rabba shvichas shirayim v'aktaras emurim, from where do we know to include the pouring out of the remainder of the blood and the burning of the emurim? Talmud lomar, the pasuk says, vim he'achol ye'achel, it says if it will be consumed, b'shtei achilos hakasim medaber. The pasuk here, by saying he'achol ye'achel, is talking about two different kinds of consumption. Achas achilas adam v'achas achilas mizbeach. The consumption, one is the consumption by a person, and one is the consumption by the mizbeach. Both of those are considered to be pigel. And the Gemara continues and answers along the lines of what Rashi said before. Lo kasha, it's not difficult. Hada amar, in one case we're talking about a situation where a person says, Hareini zorek, I'm throwing the blood, al menas lishboch shirayim lemachar, on the condition to pour out the remainder of the blood tomorrow. And Hadi amar, in the other case we're talking about a situation where the person says, Hareini shofech shirayim, I'm pouring out the remainder of the blood, al menas lahakter emurin lemachar, on the condition to burn the emurim tomorrow, meaning to say the machshava has to be during one of the major avodos, let's say like zrika. If the person at the time of the zrika is thinking lishboch shirayim lemachar is considered to be an achila, so that is pigel. But if during the shvichas shirayim, during the pouring out of the remainder of the blood, which is not a critical avoda, that's when the person has the machshavas pigel, and the machshava he has is lahakter emurim lemachar, to burn the emurim tomorrow, that would not be pigel because he's having the machshava during the pouring out of the shirayim, which is not one of the critical avodos of the dam of the carbon. And Rashi explains, again back on the previous Amud, Ushvichas Shirayim lo paslu b'machshava, the pouring out of the Shirayim, it's not a disqualification of the Machshavas Pigel, the Katani Leil Yachol Shani Marbav Shvichas Shirayim, because we said in the Brisa earlier that one might think to include Shvichas Shirayim, it's not included. Ela b'achilas basar, so again one might think it's only by the achilas basar, b'shachishev lechol basar chutz lizmano, when one thinks to eat the meat outside of the time. Minayin l'rabo Shvichas Shirayim, from where do we know to include the pouring out of the remainder of the blood? V'kol shekein tchilas rika, and certainly the beginning of the zrika process would be included. And Rashi continues, lo kash, it's not difficult. Hadukam marbi shvichas shirayim, when we're including shvichas shirayim, kegon damar hareini zorek o achas mishar avodos. That's when a person says, I'm going to throw the blood or do one of the other critical avodos, al menas lishboch shirayim lamacher, on the condition, with the intention to pour out the shirayim tomorrow. Sharei chishev lahachil es hamizbeach chutz lezmano. That's considered a machshava to feed it, so to speak, to the mizbeach outside of the proper time. When we're excluding shvichas shirayim earlier, that's if during the time of the shvichas shirayim he has that kind of intention. And klala demil, so the general rule, says Rashi, is ba'inon machshava b'shas avoda al davar achilas adam olam mizbeach. You need to have the machshava during the time of the avoda, and that has to be with regards, you're having a wrong intention with regards to the consumption of a person of the carbon, or to the consumption of the mizbeach of the carbon. Hilkach, therefore, chisha b'shas shvichas shirayim, if the intention is, if the thought is during the time of the pouring out of the remainder of the blood, al achilas basar, about the consumption of the meat, lo klumhi, that's nothing. To lo have a machshava b'shas avoda, because that's not a machshava during the time of the avoda. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Amar Rabbi Yehuda bereider Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Chia, says, Shamati, I heard, shetvilas etzba mefageles bechatos pnimis, that the dipping of the finger creates pigul by the inner chatos. And Rashi explains, Shamati, I heard my Rabbosai from my Rebbeim, Shetvilas etzba, that the dipping of the finger ha'amor bechatos hapnimios, which is stated by the inner chatos, v'taval hakohen etzbo, it says by the inner chatos, the kohen dips his finger in the blood, and inner chatos is where the blood is sprinkled inside of the Beis HaMikdash, not on the Mizbeach, which is outside of the Heichol. Mefageles bechatos, so the dipping of the finger by the chatos hapnimios, that creates pickle by a carbon chatos, meaning im taval al menas lahakter imum. Let's say a person dips his finger in the blood with the intention of burning the emurim the next day, meaning outside of the time frame, that's going to create pigul. And the Gemara continues, Shama Ilfa heard this, Amra Kame de Rev Pedah, and he said this in front of Rev Pedah. The Bach has the gears of Bar Pedah, he said it in front of Bar Pedah. Amar, he said, Klum lamadnu pigul ela mishlamim. Don't we learn pigul from carbon shlamim? Ma shlamim, and just like by shlamim, ein tvilas etzba mefagelis, there's no pigul by the dipping of the finger, because there is no dipping of the finger by shlamim. Ein tvilas etzba mefagelis bohen, there is no dipping of the finger that creates pigul by them. Afchatos, so too by chatos, ein tvilas etzba mefagelis bohen. The dipping of the finger does not create pigul by a carbon chatos. And Rashi explains, Klum lamadnu pigul bechatos ela mishlamim. Where do we learn pigul by chatos from? We learn from shlamim. The ikar pigul b'shlamim ksiv, because the main source of pigul is written by carbon shlamim. It says v'im he'achol ye'ochel. That's the pasuk of pigul. That's by shlamim. U'shlamim ein bohen tvilas etzba. By shlamim, you don't even have the dipping of the finger. Shekol hadamim b'zrika min haklila mizbeach, because all of the bloods of zrika you throw from a vessel to the mizbeach. Again, that's the outer mizbeach. Chutz min hachatos, with the exception of chatos, she b'matanas etzba. There, the application of the blood is with the finger. So if we're learning from shlamim, and by shlamim there is no tvilas etzba, so obviously tvilas etzba is not going to cause pigul. So too by chatos, tvilas etzba should not cause pigul. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'chi hakol mishlamim lamadnu, do we learn everything from shlamim? Ima shlamim shalo lishman, by shlamim, let's say it's done shalo lishma, not for the sake of the carbon shlamim, ein motzi midei pigul, that doesn't take away from the possibility of pigul. Af chatas shalo lishma, will you say the same thing about a carbon chatas shalo lishma? Ein motzi midei pigul, are you going to say that it doesn't take away from the possibility of pigul? And Rashi explains, Uparchinan, and we ask, V'chi hakol mishlamim lamadnu, do we learn everything from shlamim? Din pigul b'chol hazvachim kedino b'shlamim, does the halachos of pigul, are they the same by all karbonos just like they are by shlamim? Ima shlamim ein shalo l'shmo motzio midei pigul, by shlamim, if you have a machshava shalo l'shmo, that doesn't undo the possibility of pigul. Meaning, im shachat b'machshavas chutz l'zmanu, let's say he slaughters the animal with the intention of chutz l'zmanu, which is the intention of pigul. V'kibel v'holech shalo l'shman, and then he goes ahead and receives the blood, and he cares carries the blood shalol lishmon, lo yatsu midei pigul, and that doesn't take away the pigul. Sharei ein shalol lishmo posel b'shlamim, because having a machshava shalol lishmo does not disqualify a carbon shlamim. V'havalei karev hamatir k'mitzvaso, and so therefore the matir of the carbon is being brought properly, because again shalol lishmo doesn't disqualify, and therefore the pigul below psul machshava acher. So you then have a situation where you have pigul with no other disqualification, no other disqualifying intention, and therefore it is pigul. Af chatas, are you going to say the same thing by chatas? Af al pi shalol lishmo pasel ba, even though shalol lishmo it does disqualify by a chatas, because again chatas and carbon pesach they're completely disqualified by a machshava shalol lishmo. Lo totziena midei pigul, you're going to say that it doesn't take it away from the possibility of pigul, but we didn't learn like that. Vanon tanan beperak beis, we learned in the Mishnah in the second parak, ha pesach v'hachatas sheshachtan chutz lizmano. If you have a carbon pesach and you have a carbon chatas that are slaughtered outside of the proper time frame, meaning again a pigul, v'kibel v'holach v'zark shalol lishmo, and then he receives the blood or carries the blood or throws the blood shalol lishmo, zeu shalo karav hamatir k'mitzvaso. That's called lo karav hamatir k'mitzvaso. The carbon wasn't brought properly. Ve'ena pigul le'onish kares alachilasov, so it's not pigul, and a person is not going to be punished with kares when he eats it. K'di alfinun beperak beis mikra, like we learn in the second parak from the pasuk, k'hartzoas kosher kach hartzoas pigul, like the way it's accepted when it's a kosher carbon, that has to be the way it's accepted by pigul, meaning sheyikrevu kol matirin, meaning all of the matirin, dahainu arba avodos, that's the four essential avodos of the blood of a carbon, they have to be brought below psul machshava acheres with no other disqualifying intention. And so therefore, since shalol lishmo is a disqualifying intention by chatas, that really should take away the possibility of pigul. And so clearly, since we say that it does take away the possibility of pigul, we're not learning all of the halachas and the particulars of the halachas of pigul from carbon shlamim. And so the Gemara continues and says, Ela mayis loch lamema, rather, what do you have to say? Me ribuya dekroi kasi, it's all learned from inclusions in the pasuk, in the psukim. Hachanami me ribuya dekroi kasi, here also we're going to say that it's learned from the inclusions of the pasuk. And Rashi explains, Ela mayis loch lamema me ribuya dekroi kasi, kol hazvachim lepigol b'toras kohanim. We're learning from inclusions all karbonos for pigol. V'lo mishlamim lamda, we're not really learning from shlamim. It doesn't have to follow all the details of shlamim. Hilkach kol chad v'chad, therefore, by each carbon, my deposal, whatever is a disqualifying intention, motziu midei pigul, will undo the possibility of pigul. V'chein le'inyan hava'aso lidei pigul, and similarly, when it comes to what creates pigul, kol chad v'chad, my dechsiv bei dehave avoda, each carbon, whatever is an avoda by that carbon, mevio lidei pigul, that brings it to pigul. And again, by the chatos apnimios, since the dipping of the finger in the blood is part of the avoda, that can create pigul. At that stage, pigul can happen. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, Ba'aliyah zu shamati, in this upper story I heard, shetvilas etzba mifageles, that tvilas etzba, the dipping of the finger again by the inner chatos, that is considered to be an important enough avoda that it can create pigul. And the Gemara continues, Tehi bar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish, he wondered about this. Klum lamdu pigul elam mishlamim, don't we learn pigul from the carbon shlamim? Ma shlamim ein tvilas etzba mifageles behen, again, just like shlamim, there is no tvilas etzba, and therefore it's not going to create pigul. Av chatos, so too by the carbon chatos, ein tvilas etzba mifageles behen, there should not be pigul by the tvilas etzba, by the dipping of the finger. But the Gemara continues, V'chi hakol mishlamim lamdu, do we learn everything from shlamim? Ima shlamim, whereas by shlamim, shalol lishmon, ein motzi midei pigul. If it's shalol lishmo, again by carbon shlamim, that does not disqualify the carbon, so that's not going to take away from pigul. So af chatos shalol lishmo, ein motzi midei pigul, will you say that by chatos, shalol lishmo will not take away from pigul? Of course, shalol lishmo does take away from pigul, as we just said above. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina says, in yes, hakol mishlamim lamdu, actually everything is learned from shlamim. And hoil v'chutz l'mekomo posel b'shlamim, since, let's say a person has a machshava, an intent, chutz l'mekomo, that would disqualify by shlamim. V'shalol l'shmo posel b'chatos, and shalol l'shmo similarly is a disqualification by carbon chatos. So ma chutz l'mekomo ha-posel b'shlamim, just like chutz l'mekomo, which is a disqualification by shlamim, motzi midei pigul, that would take away pigul. Av shalol l'shmo ha-posel b'chatos, so too shalol l'shmo, which disqualifies by carbon chatos, motzia midei pigul, that would take away from pigul. And the point of the answer over here is that it is in fact true. When it comes to shalol l'shmo by carbon chatos, that is motzia midei pigul, but still everything really is being learned from shlamim, and therefore since there's no tvilas etzba by shlamim, therefore by carbon chatos, by the inner chatos as well, tvilas etzba is not going to be mifagelas. And Rashi explains, in yes, hakol mishlomim lamadnu, everything is learned from shlomim. Udekashalach bechatas heich shelo lishmo motzi midei pigel. And then your question was, by chatas, how is it that shelo lishmo takes away pigel? The answer to that is, hoel v'chutz l'mekomo, since outside of the proper place, meaning machsheves al menas la'ochlo chutz l'mechitzas achiloso, if somebody has intent to eat it outside of the area where it's supposed to be eaten, dahainu b'chol ha'ir, when it comes to a carbon shlomim that's eaten in the whole city of Yerushalayim, v'chutz outside of the city of Yerushalayim, it's considered outside of the proper place. So posel b'shlamim, we know that's a disqualification by the shlamim if you have a machshava chutz l'mekomo, and that's behed yomar binan lo lepsula b'perek beis elo she'ein bo kares. Explicitly in the second parak, we're going to have an inclusion that says that it's disqualified, but there's not going to be kares in the case of chutz l'mekomo. It's not exactly like chutz l'zmano, but it still is a disqualification, and therefore motzi midei pigel, it takes away from pigel, kedi alfinan b'perek beis, like we learn in perek beis, shekol machsheves psul, any kind of intent that creates a disqualification, motziyasu midei pigel, that takes away from the pigel disqualification. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Mitzida ta'aver, from the argument you're making, it's broken, meaning to say, we can respond based on the internal logic of the argument itself. Ma'alechutz l'mekomo, when it comes to chutz l'mekomo, haposel b'shlamim, which again is a disqualification by carbon shlamim, shekein noeg b'chol hazvachim, that applies by all karbonos. Tomar b'shalo l'shmo, whereas by the disqualification of shalo l'shmo, she'eino noeg ella b'pesach v'chatos bilvad, that only applies by carbon pesach and carbon chatos. Elamayis loch l'meimer, rather, what do you have to say? Dover haposel bohen, whatever disqualifies by them, motziyim midei pigel, that's the basic rule. Whatever is a disqualification is what takes away from pigel. But if we're going to have that logic, so then dover hama'akev bohen, so whatever is a required stage in the process of the avoda, mevian l'dei pigel, that can cause pigel. So by that argument, hachinami, so according to that here also, dover haposel ba motzi midei pigel, whatever disqualifies takes away from pigel, and dover hama'akev ba mevian l'dei pigel, anything that's ma'akev, that's required, will cause pigel to happen, meaning to say, from that argument itself, we can really argue that tevilas etzba, that the dipping of the finger, which is a critical part of the avoda of the chatos apnimios, of the inner chatos, that would in fact bring to pigel if you have a machshava, an intent chutz lizmano. And Rashi explains, Mitzida Tavra Teshuvasa Betzida, the answer is right by its side, meaning to say, from the argument you're making, we can respond. If you're learning from Chutz L'Mekomo to Shalo L'Shmo, and also you're saying that pigel can only take place in avodos that happen by shlamim and nothing further, just that in terms of taking away from pigel, Tilmud Bechatas Shalo L'Shmo, Michutz L'Mekomo to Shlamim, that you're trying to learn Chatas Shalo L'Shmo from Chutz L'Mekomo of Shlamim, Yesh L'Hashav, we can respond as follows. Mala Chutz L'Mekomo, when it comes to Chutz L'Mekomo, Dinu Sheyotzi Midei Pigel, that makes sense to say that it takes away from pigel. Sharei Psul V'Chomer Linhog B'Chol Azvachim, because that is a psul and that is stringent enough that it applies by all karbonos. Tomar, whereas you're going to say by Shalo L'Shmo, that doesn't apply by all karbonos. Elamayis Loch L'Memer, so what do you have to say? In Basel Lomar HaKol Mishlamim Lomda, if you're going to try to say that everything's learned from Shlamim, what reason can you give by Shalo L'Shmo Hamotzi Chatos Midei Pigel that will take the Chatos away from Pigel? Kach Yesh Lach Lomer, you're going to have to say an argument something along the following lines. Shlamim Dover Haposel Behu, by Shlamim something which is a disqualification. Kegon Chutz L'Mekomo, for example, Chutz L'Mekomo Motzion Midei Pigel, that takes away from Pigel, and so too by Chatos, whatever disqualifies Chatos. But by that same logic, V'Dover Hama'ake Behu, also any avoda that's required, Kegon Dalit avodos hadam, like the 4 avodos you do with the blood, mevi'in l'dei pigel, that causes pigel. So according to that, hachanami here also af chatos, so too by chatos, davar haposel bo kagon shalo l'shma motzia, something that disqualifies like shalo l'shma will take away the pigel. V'davar hama'akeba, and something that's required, kol hakosa ba'avodas damu tvilas etzba b'chlal, meaning anything that's written in the avoda of its blood, including the dipping of the finger. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Mori says, Afan non nami tanina, we learned like this in a Mishnah, this is in Meseches Menachos, it says by carbon mincha, zeh haklal, this is the rule, kol hakometz v'nosin bekli, anybody who takes the kamitza, the fistful of the carbon mincha, places it in the vessel, v'hamolech, and somebody who's now bringing it to the mizbeach, v'hamakter, and burning it on the mizbeach, all of those are included in pigel when it comes to carbon mincha, meaning all of those stages of the avoda are included in machshavas pigel. If you have a machshava chutz l'zmanu during any of those parts of the avoda, it will be pigul. And the Gemara says, Bishlama kometz. Now I understand taking the kmitza, hainu shochet, that's the equivalent of slaughtering an animal, and molech hainu molech, and then taking it to the mizbeach is the equivalent of taking the blood to the mizbeach, and maktir nami hainu zorik, and then burning it on the mizbeach is the same as throwing the blood at the mizbeach. So all of those make sense. Elanosin bekli mainiu, but what's the equivalent of placing the kometz in the vessel? Ilema de dami lekabbalah, if you're going to say that it's similar to kabbalah, the receiving of the blood, mi dami, is it really similar? Hasam memela, the receiving of the blood happens automatically, it just goes into the vessel. But hachabat over here, when you're taking the kometz and placing it in the kli, so iu kash shakel v'rami, he's taking it and placing it there. So that's not analogous to kabbalah, and so therefore why is that included in pigul? Ella rather, keva de lo sagi de lo yoif, since it's impossible not to put it in there, al karche avoda chashuvahi, so it must be considered an important avoda. And any important avoda can be mevili de pigul. So hachanami, so to here by the inner chatos. Keva de lo sagi de lo avila, since it's impossible not to do the dipping of the finger in the blood, al karche hainu holacha, you have to say that that's considered to be holacha, and again, therefore we would say it would be able to bring to pigul. But the Gemara says, lo no, liolam dedami lekabbalah, really, when it comes to the placing of the kometz in the vessel, that is similar to the kabbalah, the receiving of the blood in the vessel. Udeka'amr, and that which you asked, hacham emela hasam iu kashakal v'yoev, that over here it happens automatically by the blood, but by the kometz he has to take it and put it in. But kevan de'idi v'idi matan kliu, since in both cases it's being placed in the vessel, mali memela, what difference does it make if it happens automatically? Mali kashakal v'yoev, what difference does it make if he's taking it and giving it, taking it and placing it there? And so therefore there is no proof from this Mishnah, because in this Mishnah it essentially is the same as Kabbalah when you place the kometz in the kli. And the Gemara continues, Lema ketanoi, let us say that this is actually a machlokas tanoim. Again, this issue, by the dipping of the finger in the blood by the inner chatos, whether it's able to bring to pigul, it's a machlokas tanoim. Tetani chada, because we learned in one brisa, tvilas etzba mifageles bechatos. It says that the dipping of the finger can make pigul by chatos. V'tan yidach, we learned in another brisa, lo mifageles v'lo mispageles. It does not create pigul. We'll see Rashi in a moment with regards to the two terms. But the Gemara says, my lav tanoi, doesn't this show that it's a machlokas tanoim? And the Gemara says, lo, no. Harabonon, Haravi Shimon. One is following the Rabbonon in our Mishnah, and one is following Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. And Rashi explains, lo mefagelis means, im taval al minas lahakter emur lamacher. That would mean, let's say he dips his finger, and he was thinking he had the intention to burn the emurim the next day outside of the proper time. That's mifagelis. And velo mispagelis means, im shachar o kibel al minas litval etzba lamacher. Let's say, for example, he slaughters, and at the time of the slaughtering, he has intention to dip his finger. So now the dipping of the finger is what you're having the intention towards. So if you're having intention during the time of slaughtering to dip the finger in the wrong time, tomorrow, so then again, lo misbagelis, it's not going to be pigul in that case as well. In any case, again, it's a machlokas in brises. So my lav tanoi, isn't it a machlokas tanoim? Demar chashav laholacha, one would put it in the category of holacha, the dipping of the finger into the blood, and so therefore if it's holacha, it's a critical avoda, and it could bring to pigul. Umar lo chashav laholacha, and the other one doesn't consider it to be holacha. And the Gemara then said, lo no, dekuli alma holacha, everybody agrees it is holacha. V'hadikatani eina mefagelis, and the brisa which says it's not pigul, because if it's holacha, it really should bring to pigul. That is Rabbi Shimon. That's Rabbi Shimon of our Mishnah. The Yomar b'mas nisan, because Rabbi Shimon said in our Mishnah, holacha lo mefagli. He said in general holacha is not a critical enough avoda to create pigul. Kedetanan, like we learned in our Mishnah of Rabbi Shimon, machshir behilach. That Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher by hilach, by the conveying of the blood. But the Gemara continues and asks, Rabbi Shimon, if you're going to say that Bryce is Rabbi Shimon, my irya tvilas etzba, what does he have to deal with the case of the dipping of the finger? Ha'amar, doesn't Rabbi Shimon say? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yudalid Amud Aleph.